On a cool and rainy day, if you have the time, there's nothing quite like making stew in the traditional way. Here's how you do it. So there are two important things to think about when you're going to make stew. And one is the pot that you're going to use. You want a nice heavy gauge pot with a tight fitting lid and one that can go into the oven. The second important thing is, of course, what piece of meat you're going to use. Here I've got a piece of chuck roast. Really flavorful, but it's tough. So it's going to need some time to break down and become tender. We're going to cut this up ourselves, and I'm going to cut them into chunks that are bigger than you think you need. It's going to shrink as you cook it. Those pieces of meat are going to become smaller. We want them bite-sized when the stew is finished, so we're going to start bigger than bite-sized as we're starting to stew. So we're going to go about 2-inch chunks here for our beef stew. Let's get some heat underneath this pan. Now I'm going to go to a medium-high heat. Because this is a cast iron pan, it's going to take a minute to get nice and warm. So let that sit. This is not a part of the stew that we're going to rush. So once your pan is nice and hot, we're going to add some olive oil. A fair amount of olive oil here, and as soon as you put it into that hot pan, you should see it start to move. That's telling you the pan is hot, now the oil is hot, we're ready to brown the beef. Now the most important thing here is not to overcrowd the pan. If you put too much beef in at one time, you're going to get liquid in the bottom of the pan. It's not going to be browning, it's going to be stewing already in its own juices. So we want to see the bottom of the pan still, even while the beef is in there. We're going to let that cook. We're going to season it with some salt and pepper. We're going to do this in batches. It's going to take some time, but it's important steps, so be patient. So once your beef is browned on all sides, you see some good color there, you know it's time to move it to that batch of browned beef bowl. And now we're going to focus on the other part. The most important part of a beef stew, aside from the meat, is the sauce. So we've got beautiful browning on the bottom of that pot, and we're going to use all that flavor in our sauce. First thing we're going to do is add some onion. Now, whatever vegetables you add to the pot right now are going to be pretty mushy by the time your stew's finished, because this beef stew has to cook for at least 2 hours. So we're not adding carrots and potatoes and things like that now. We're adding onion and garlic, which is going to give flavor to our sauce. So let's saute this for just a couple minutes. You're going to see it start to bring all that brown up off the bottom of the pot. We're going to add another flavor component. Every time you add an ingredient to the stew, you should be adding flavor. And what we're going to add here is some tomato paste. Tomato paste is really just concentrated tomato flavor. It's always nice to brown it a little bit first, to even concentrate it more. So I can see what's happening here in this pot right now, and it's starting to get a little dark on the bottom. So let's skip over to the next step, which is adding some red wine. Now when we add that red wine, that's going to cool the pan down a little bit, and we're going to be able to bring all of that delicious browning off the bottom. It's really important when you add your wine that it's a wine that you would drink. And I say that not just because you're probably not going to use the whole bottle in the cooking, but because if you don't like the flavor of an ingredient by itself, you shouldn't be putting it into something that you're going to finish cooking. This has picked up so much of that browning. The color has changed completely. It's already becoming that deep, rich sauce that we want with our stew. We're going to put a bay leaf in. We're going to put some dried rosemary and some dried thyme in here. And then we're going to add some Worcestershire sauce. That's going to give us another whole level of flavor. And I'm going to add some stock. Now I've got 3 cups of stock here. I'm only going to add 2 cups right now. I'm saving that other cup of stock because depending on how you're going to cook this stew, you could cook it in the oven and you're going to have very little evaporation. If you cook it on the stove top at a very low simmer, you'll have a little more evaporation and you might want to add some stock later on. But let's put our beef meat back in here now. Remember, we're making a stew, not a soup, so we do not need to cover the meat with liquid, but have a little bit of the meat poking up the top there. I'm going to season it one more time with some salt. We're going to cover it with that tight-fitting lid, and we're going to either put this into an oven at 275 degrees, or we're going to simmer it on the stovetop. You don't want to be boiling your stew. That's going to end up with tough meat. We want to have a nice low simmer. If you have a thermometer, you're looking for about 180 degrees. Otherwise, you're just looking for a few bubbles here and there. So once that meat has been gently simmering for about an hour, it's time to add the vegetables that we want in our stew. We're making a very basic stew here today, but you can feel free to make this your own. What are you in the mood for? If you like root vegetables, add turnips, parsnips. Today, it's a basic stew. We're adding some carrots, and we're gonna add some potatoes. I've left them in kind of big chunks because this is now going to cook for another hour. We're gonna give it a stir and let that go either in the oven at 275 or on the stovetop, again at that gentle, gentle simmer. So as we're approaching the end of our second hour of simmering our stew, I'm gonna start to saute some vegetables to put in the stew. Now, I'm gonna add some pearl onions. They're a classic ingredient in a basic stew, but I don't wanna boil my onions. Remember, there were onions at the very beginning to give our sauce flavor. These are gonna be onions that we're gonna enjoy and wanna eat. I'm gonna saute them in a little bit of olive oil on the stovetop in a separate pan, get some nice color on them so they're pretty, and then put them into the stew. But I always go a little darker when I'm adding vegetables to a stew because once they get into the liquid, the color fades a little bit. So nice dark color on those onions. I'm gonna add them right to our simmering stew just to get all those flavors blended. Give it a good stir, get the pieces of meat that were not submerged down to the bottom, and let this go gently simmering, making that house smell beautiful for another half hour. It's time to see if our stew is ready. Let's check the meat and make sure the meat is nice and tender. So I'm just gonna pull out a piece. Oh, it looks great. It looks beautiful. It's falling apart with just a fork. That's what I wanna see. I'm gonna put in some frozen peas. All they have to do is heat through, which will take just a couple minutes. I'm gonna season it with some parsley as well for color. This is gonna make a lot of people very, very happy. That is a happy bowl of stew.